Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Europe Climate Connection, the podcast that discusses a wide range of issues related to the climate emergency and energy transition by featuring the member organizations of Climate Action Network Europe. I'm Olivia, and I'm joined today by my co-host Rachel.
Hi Olivia, how's it going? Well, we've got another cracking episode. We'll be talking about concepts that are becoming more and more trendy, like sufficiency and the lesser known enoughness. So what do these mean? What mindset change is needed? And what are the policy changes needed to mainstream these concepts in our daily lives?
Indeed, Rachel, sufficiency is essentially linked to limiting our own consumption, and we need to understand what the imbalances, the power struggles, and inequalities are behind that, because it is a social justice problem as well. In this episode, we will also discuss the EU's responsibility and role to address these issues.
Our guest today is Agata Meysner from the Institute for European Environmental Policy, or IEPP. Welcome to our podcast, Agata.
Hi, thanks a lot for having me today on your podcast.
So, Agata, we've been hearing now for a while about efficiency, which is how to save energy and resources, particularly in production processes. But there's also this concept of sufficiency popping up that is slowly being mainstreamed by science. I mean, we saw it in the IPCC report, which is the panel on climate change there. Very high profile report. But it's not yet so much in policy making. So could you explain to us what is actually meant by sufficiency?
Yeah, sure. So sufficiency doesn't actually have one strict definition. Because the roots are derived from various fields. So this would be most notably ecological economics, political ecology, and also ecological philosophy. So these three core areas where it comes from. But if you think about the core of the concepts, essentially it's this objective to reach the state of enoughness from the perspective of both our ecosystems and also our social and economic systems. So it essentially implies a change in our values from more and faster to less and slower. And it is very much so about reassessing our needs as society. So sufficiency very much emphasizes this importance of well-being and of a more just distribution of the resources that are provided by our planet.
So yeah, it's a lot more than I think what most people, and especially me, when I think of sufficiency, I often just think of energy. And of course, it doesn't just apply to that. It's a much broader concept, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. So it is indeed, as you said, a broader concept that applies beyond energy. So when we think about materials, we should think about biomass, about fossil fuels, about metals, and also non-metallic minerals. So, and although if you think about this, consumption and production are key elements of sufficiency, I think it is about more than that. So the idea really is that by reducing that material dependency and shifting to those non-material values, our well-being would actually increase and we can thrive more as a society.
Now, looking a bit more specifically at the extraction of resources and raw materials. So the extraction of the resources and raw materials that Europe needs has enormous ecological and human rights impacts. Have you studied these impacts? Can you elaborate a bit on what those are and what needs to change to address them properly?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, before we jump into those impacts, I think it's really important to also highlight the inequalities, the underlying inequalities that are part of reducing resource consumption, because if we look at our material footprint, so that's the total consumption of fossil fuels, of biomass, of metals, and of non-metallic minerals, that is currently at 14.5 tons per capita, which is around double the sustainable and just level that's estimated by the various studies. And EU, in fact, uses between 70 and 97% of the safe operating space that's available for the whole world, which leaves between 30% and 3% for the rest of the world. So you can already see that very much exposes those underlying inequalities in this area and the consequence that it brings. And as you mentioned, extraction of raw materials has a number of environmental and human rights impacts. Many of them are in fact, or majority of them are in fact, located in the global south. So when we think about environmental impacts, that includes destruction of habitats, soil contamination, that includes also animals and plant species suffering certain disturbances. In fact, extraction of natural resources causes more than 90% of biodiversity loss and 50% of greenhouse gas emissions. So again, we have that element of how interconnected it is also with other elements. It's not just about materials, it's very much about biodiversity, it's very much about climate. And when we think about human rights impacts, we can think of violence that is used against communities that are opposing mining, and also communities that have to be forcibly displaced because of mining operations. So I think this really exposes the global north, the global south divide in this problem of extraction of raw materials, and also why it's so important when we do address that topic that EU takes responsibility as the main extractor of raw materials and understands that the decisions that it takes will not only impact Europe, but in fact will have a huge impact outside of its borders. I think there is a growing understanding at the EU level that the EU indeed has a huge responsibility in addressing these issues, and their actions also have huge consequences. I wouldn't say at the moment that as the EU is accepting full responsibility. I think we have still a long way to go. And it's not just a matter of one policy or one measure here and there. I think it's very much so about a policy-wise approach. So I think we are in a way moving more there, but this is a really difficult issue because it is so much about the power struggle. It is so much about looking at the impact of corporations, looking at the 1% richest part of the population. So it can't be resolved in one night. It can't be resolved with one measure. It's something that requires a number of stakeholders on board and initiatives that are cross-sectoral for sure.
And talking about the EU and their agenda, there's actually quite a few ongoing processes that are linked to circularity and eco-design. But how far do you feel that they really go, especially in the frame of the European Green Deal, which by its very nature is based on growth?
Yeah, that's true. So when you think about EU circular economy, an increasing number of EU circular economy initiatives are placing more importance on actions higher up in the waste hierarchy. So reducing and reusing, and that can be seen particularly from the last circular economy action plan. But it is true that there's a lack of measures that are targeting the top of the waste hierarchy. So refusing and rethinking our products, which limits this potential for ensuring that we have that absolute reduction of resource consumption in the EU. And this is also something we have been looking into in one of our recent reports at IEEP that's analyzed circular economy initiatives since the publication of the new CAP in 2020. And as you mentioned, the European Green Deal indeed continues to prioritize growth. And I think it's very important that we address that, because without an overarching EU strategy addressing the limits to consuming our resources, we just won't be able to move towards sufficiency pathways in EU policy. And I think this is also why targets and having targets is so important. Is they play such a key role because they set that vision for the upcoming future. And we've seen climate policies have been driven by emissions reduction targets, and they resulted in a number of different initiatives. But we have no equivalent targets in the circular economy policies.
And do you think that we'll get to a stage where that is a reality, that we will have those targets? Are the EU taking sufficiency seriously?
I would hope so. That's something that we are pushing for. So from the side of IEP, the European Parliament has called the European Commission to put forward these targets, and the circular economy monitoring framework revision also plays a key role there. So I think that's really something that can be a game changer at the EU level, and really, as we saw with climate, as I mentioned, results in a number of measures that are coming out of it. And this is not just about policy, but also about business action, about academia and many other fields that would be affected by targets like that.
Absolutely. And that's a mindset change across the board, citizens, policymakers, businesses. And looking at businesses, what role do you think they can play in that shift that you'd like to see and we'd all like to see from efficiency to sufficiency?
I think corporations are really hugely important. I mean, if you look at the impact of a lot of businesses, they really play a huge role. And I think when we think also about the sufficiency vision for the future, we also need to understand that entails that some sectors will have to shrink and some sectors will have to grow. So put more emphasis on, for example, green care economy, so on our healthcare. But at the same time, also make sure that we reduce certain sectors, such as the oil and gas industry, which is very destructive for our planet.
Production and demand is largely driven by big energy-intensive industries and huge multinationals who are pushing a tech-focused green transformation. Now, this is clearly an issue from a cost perspective, as it's super expensive. But what are the other detrimental impacts that might arise from seeing technology as the panacea?
So the industrial strategy is largely driven by demands of large multinationals, energy-intensive industries, and many of their federations. They're essentially pushing a technology-focused transformation that, as you said, will be expensive and might be coming with some questionable outcomes. There's a lot of uncertainty on the proposed technologies and their developments. And there are also a number of questions around social and environmental consequences. And I think something important to mention is that this rapidly growing digital sector is actually a key driver of metal demand. And I think this is a challenge that's overlooked in between green and digital transition. So we talk about that. So the emphasis of that decarbonization potential of the green technology essentially takes away the attention from that huge material demand that it will create. So, for example, when you think about electric vehicles, although they of course have a great potential to reduce emissions and they have been on the agenda increasingly so, they also generate a rapid demand increase for key raw materials. And I think something important to highlight here is that a sufficiency approach to addressing sustainable transport would be to, instead of focusing on new technological advancements, to take a step back and understand how we can promote a move towards walking, towards biking, towards public transport. If you look at the data, an average car is actually used only 5% of the time. So 95% of the time we don't even use it. It's just parked somewhere at our house or somewhere else. And only 3% is actually driving. And the other percent is being stuck into traffic or doing other things. And that really makes you think about why are cars so hugely popular, particularly also in cities where we have a number of alternatives. We've seen a lot of proposals being designed around these 15 minutes districts, being able to access things much easier, making public transport cheaper, so to also incentivize people to use it. So in a way, sufficiency to me is a lot about a mindset change. In the way that we approach these challenges in our society and just rethinking the solutions that we're putting forward.
So when it comes to consumption and resource use, there's a huge amount of imbalance and inequality globally. And as we touched on earlier, extractivism So how can we get this idea of social justice higher on the general public's radar?
So indeed, I mean, global extraction of materials rose very rapidly in the past century, much faster than the growth in population, and there are, as you said, those underlying inequalities globally. So, I think a very important thing here is to understand that the topic of resource consumption reduction is actually not just an environmental topic. We've seen a number of environmental organizations putting it forward, and IEEP also being an environmental organization, this is also the angle that we're coming from. But it is very much a social justice issue too, exactly because of those underlying inequalities, and because reducing resource consumption as a society doesn't mean that everyone will have to do it in the same way. It is really about understanding the privilege that comes with the current consumption patterns and translating that into responsibility that you have as an individual, as a government, as a corporation, to putting forward ambitious measures to address that.
To come back to this shift to a society where we consume less and the role of advertisement in that, can you maybe elaborate?
So one of the policy proposals that is being put forward when we talk about sufficiency, when we talk about reducing resource consumption, is tackling advertising. As I'm sure many of our listeners have also experienced, wherever you go, whether it's an online or an offline space, you're bombarded with advertising. And it's advertising of products that I'm pretty sure you don't actually need. This is very much this consumerism idea of having to have more products, more things. So obviously, when we rethink our needs as a society, when we move away from these material needs, this is something that needs to be addressed. Less advertising or no advertising, understanding which things do we advertise and why, and particularly also understanding that every product is not just a product. It comes with environmental and social consequences for people that we might not see when we purchase it.
What's the role of regulation to change the role of advertising?
Yeah, sure. So I think obviously governments and policymakers play a really big role. I think, we've seen that with some, with tobacco products, for example, the way that tobacco products have been advertised, have been present in different spaces have changed a lot. And this is a result of a change in our society and how we're approaching that because of health impacts. These are products that have become less popular, that at least public is more aware of those consequences. I don't think that same state of understanding is yet widely present when we talk about environmental impacts of certain products, when we talk about social impacts of certain products.
Absolutely. And I'd just like to return really quickly to production and whether or not you think there are any sectors that could perhaps be put on a bit of a pedestal, perhaps as good examples that are more transparent, that are more sustainable, they have more ethically sourced materials. I mean, we talk about fashion, right? And I think that's something that has become quite trendy in that sector to talk about, okay, so this product has been ethically sourced or, but it's still, at the end of the day, it's still fast fashion. Although it's been ethically sourced, you're still encouraging people to buy more clothes. You're not necessarily encouraging people to reuse, to repair those clothes, to buy secondhand. So yeah, for me, because you spoke about fashion, I was like, how green, how sustainable is the fashion industry? And sometimes it appears that they are improving, but that's not necessarily the reality.
It's definitely not necessarily the reality. And I think, this is where the whole idea of greenwashing also comes in, because it's become very popular to put forward a number of statements and initiatives that might appear more sustainable, particularly to a customer that, is maybe not knowledgeable about this or hasn't been exposed to more information about it, material footprint, or any other aspects of environmental and social impacts. So, I think when we think about sufficiency and that enoughness, as I mentioned, that state of enoughness, it's very much so really about, rethinking things a little bit. So it's, instead of saying, as I mentioned before, let's make sure that we have vehicles that emit less emissions. It shouldn't be that. It should be, okay, how can we make sure that we actually use mobility options that have no emissions? How can we make sure we can walk, so we can cycle? If you talk about fashion, of course, you can say, well, how great would it be to buy a dress that's made out of more sustainable materials? But the actual question is not that. The actual question is, do you really need that dress? Can't you just rewear the dress that you've worn before? So that's why I also mentioned a mindset change, because it is very much a mindset change, and sometimes it's a very difficult exercise to do, because you've been growing up in the system that's been bombarding you with advertising, that's been telling you that you need to behave in a certain way, that you need to function in a certain way. Taking a step back and saying, well, actually, do I really need to do this? Do I really need this? It can be difficult, but the alternative is, well, it's frightening, and that there really is no alternative. Think about it. If we keep consuming the way we do, if we keep producing the way we do, this is a complete destruction of our planet and of our society. So it's not just a nice thing to do at this point. It's an urgent step that needs to be taken for us to avoid the disaster.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. Olivia, anything else you'd like to add?
No. Thanks a lot for joining the podcast.
Thanks a lot for having me. It's been really wonderful.
Well, that brings us to the end of another episode of the Europe Climate Connection. Thank you so much to all of our listeners for joining us again. In our next episode, we'll be talking about an incredible project which showcases unheard youth climate activism across Europe. Hope you can tune in. In the meantime, you can listen to all of our previous episodes via your favorite podcasting app, and find out more about our work at caneurope.org.
You've been listening to Europe Climate Connection, an original podcast presented by Can Europe. Europe Climate Connection is hosted by Olivia Saxa and Rachel Brabbins. Samuel Martin Souza is the executive producer and editor. Script by Rachel Brabbins. Recorded and edited by Big Audio Media that also provided training, mentorship and assistance during the process.